Hi, this is a video presentation of the reputation inflation paper, which is joint work with John Horton and Joe Golden. These slides can be found in the link in the bottom of this page. In this paper, we study the reputation systems typically employed by online peer-to-peer marketplaces. Many previous researchers have found that feedback in these systems is overwhelmingly positive. For example, almost every seller on eBay gets a perfect rating. Similarly, on Airbnb, almost every host gets rated very highly. Our first question is whether this situation is good and how would we know whether it's good or not, whether it reflects that things are going well in these marketplaces. To perform this study, we draw upon a large dataset of online feedback scores from a large online labor market. And our dataset spans more than 10 years and 5 million transactions. In this labor market, the reputation system is designed as in most marketplaces. Reputation is bilateral in that both employers rate workers and workers rate employers at the end of a contract, and feedback scores are simultaneously revealed. For the purposes of this study, we focus on employer on worker feedback, which is given among two dimensions, numerically and via written feedback. So if we look at the distribution of ratings in our marketplaces, we will see that it is overwhelmingly positive, similarly to the other marketplaces. However, because our data span such a long amount of time, we can go back in time and see whether that was always the case. And we find that this was not always the case. Feedback has not always been overwhelmingly positive, but has rather become overwhelmingly positive over time, up to the point where at the end of our data set, the average feedback that is given from employers to workers is 4.8 out of 5 stars. And in fact, the distribution that we saw in the previous slide came only from the two last years in our dataset. So our first question is whether we only see that on our marketplace or in other online marketplaces. And to answer this question, we collect data from other marketplaces. What we see is a very similar pattern. Feedback scores increase a lot over time in a competing online labor market, in a home sharing market in many cities, in a marketplace for the short-term rentals of durable assets, and in a geo-segmented service online marketplace across many cities. This does not only happen in an online setting, but also in an offline setting. And perhaps the setting that most of us are familiar with is colleges. So in US colleges in the 1940s, only 15% of students received a rating, a grade of A, and in 2012, this number is 45%. So what changed from the 1940s up to 2012? And many things could have changed that are positive changes. Professors could have become 300% better, or students could have become 300% better, or teaching technology could have become 300% better. All of these reasons are positive because they reflect improvements in what's happening. In the context of online marketplaces, we call these differences improvements in platform fundamentals. Those are positive. On the other hand, another potential reason for what we observe for this increase in feedbacks is that this increase does not reflect higher quality transactions, but rather it reflects reputation inflation. A lowering in standards, getting the same degree, getting the same rating is easier over time. So in order to disentangle these two sets of reasons, improvements in fundamentals and reputation inflation, which take place possibly at the same time, is very hard because we do not observe transaction quality. There is no standard transaction in online marketplaces that we can trace over time. So our idea in this paper is to instead turn to an alternative measure that we can observe and might increase over time, but might not be subject to reputation inflation. Or it might be subject to less reputation inflation than the primary score that we observe. We will employ two sets scores, two sets alternative measures in our paper. The first alternative measure comes from private feedback that was collected concurrently to public feedback for the same set of transactions. At some point during its lifetime, the platform started eliciting private feedback from the employers for the same transactions that it was eliciting public feedback from the employers. So we can go in and compare how public feedback scores and how private feedback scores change over time for the same transactions. And private feedback score was not revealed to other employers or to the workers. The platform was just eliciting it. It was telling the employers that they were doing so for internal purposes to improve their search technology, the reputation systems, and so on. So the platform told employers that this private feedback score would never be released. So for the same transactions, we see that public feedback scores were increasing, whereas private feedback scores were decreasing, which is one piece of evidence that this increase that we see in public feedback is not reflective of higher satisfaction in employers. For a second alternative measure, we turn to written text that was given by employers after each transaction. So to make written text and numerical scores comparable, we employ some standard NLP pipeline and techniques. And what we do is we go in our data, and from a small period of time, we create a training set that comprises written feedback and the corresponding numerical scores. We learn a model, a mapping between written feedback and numerical scores, and then we go out of sample after this training set period, and we apply our model to extract what the public numerical scores should have been for each written feedback. So what we find is what this predicted numerical score would have been is much lower than the actual assigned numerical score. We also conduct several robustness tests here, such as creating our training data from another time period. But what I believe is one of the most convincing pieces of evidence is if we go in our data and we just trace the very exact phrases, the very same exact phrases, the very same reviews over time. So we can see here that, for example, in 2008, when an employer wrote in the review "good job," they used to assign 4.7 out of 5 stars, whereas in 2015, when an employer said "good job," they assign 4.95 stars. The same thing holds for bad reviews. Back in 2008, when your employer said "terrible" in the reviews, they assigned 1.5 stars. But in 2015, they assigned almost 1 star more, almost 2.5 stars on average. So if we go and put all these estimates that we can obtain together, we will see that more conservatively, at least 50% of the increase in public numerical scores we observe is due to inflation and not due to improvement in fundamentals. So our second order of business here is to try to understand why we see this reputation inflation. What causes this reputation inflation over time? And generally, many reasons could explain this pattern. For example, raters might dislike giving bad feedback for many reasons. They might not want to harm the rated workers. Rated workers might avoid harsh raters in the future. If they see that some employer gives really, really bad ratings, they avoid working with them. Or maybe workers retaliate by sending angry emails and so on. But this by itself would only explain a bias and not the trend we observe in that data, in our data. For that reason, we posit that what we need to add to these factors is that what feedback is good and what feedback is bad changes over time. So we write down a theoretical model of reputation inflation in an online marketplaces where bad feedback is costly for workers and what feedback is bad and good depends on the average score that is given on the platform each period. For example, if everybody receives 2.5 stars on average, then giving a worker 4 stars is great feedback. But it is bad feedback if everybody receives 4.8 stars on average. So what feedback is bad and what feedback is good changes over time. The second element of the model is that assigning bad feedback is costly for the person that assigns it, for the employers in our model. The cost to employers of assigning bad feedback is analogous to the cost of workers. So there's this reflected cost that is analogous to the cost of the rated party of receiving bad feedback. Employers can make a decision. They can start lying and can start inflating feedback, giving good feedback, whereas they should have given bad feedback, if this reflected cost, if the cost of assigning bad feedback to a worker becomes high enough. So if we solve this model and we solve it for equilibrium, the model explains one of the empirical facts that we see in online marketplaces, in reputation systems of online marketplaces. The fact that reputation seems to be most highly inflated if these reflected costs are high. And these costs are high in more personal settings. For example, in settings such as Uber or Airbnb, where we have peer-to-peer systems, peer-to-peer ratings, instead of review websites, restaurant websites, movie review websites, and so on. So Uber and Airbnb and so on will suffer from higher inflation, more acute inflation, whereas product review websites and so on will suffer from a more reduced amount of reputation inflation, if any. Now, our last step in this paper is to test our model directly, and we employ a quasi-experiment to directly test our model. As we mentioned before, the platform began soliciting private feedback at some point, and they saw that this private feedback was much more informative in that it was much more predictive of the future behavior of workers. So they decided to start revealing private scores to future would-be employers, and they did so in a batched, anonymized manner. So they were not displaying which employer gave which feedback, and a worker's score was only updated after 5 new private feedback scores. So the workers could not know which rater gave which feedback. So in our setting, if the employers only care about reducing retaliation from workers, this batching should work because it cannot get back to them. A bad score cannot get back to them, and reputation inflation could be minimized. On the other hand, if the employers care about not harming the rated party, the rated worker, then this public revelation of private feedback scores should kick off the inflation process that we described and that we saw in our data. So what happened in our platform is that, as we saw, private feedback scores were decreasing over time, and when the platform made this revelation, then this inflation process started happening right away. So our conclusions from our study is that peer-to-peer rating systems, which are the rating systems that most online marketplaces and online platforms employ, are likely to suffer from reputation inflation. And in our data, more than 50% of the increase in feedback scores can be attributed to reputation inflation. We believe this phenomenon is likely ubiquitous, as we saw in data from other marketplaces. And This inflation is driven by a desire not to harm the rated party instead of a fear of retaliation of the rater. This is enough to cause reputations to inflate, as we saw through a quasi-experiment. There is a lot of room here for future research, both on the implications of reputation inflation, but also on market design interventions that we can make in online marketplaces to counteract reputation inflation. Thank you for watching this video.